I'm Mallory Bateman. I'm the Director of Demographic Research over at the Gardner Institute. I'm actually going to focus at the state level and kind of zoom in and out with the county just because we don't operate as a silo in Salt Lake County. We're pretty much a center for the state, and so kind of seeing how the rest of the state interacts with this topic is really helpful. So we're going to start with some real basics. Again, Ella touched on some of these, but we'll get into it a little more. And then I'll dive into some demographic characteristics before I hand it over to Dayon for housing specific things. And any housing questions, just give them to Dayon. Don't ask me. So in the 2020 census, we had around 382,000 Utahns age 65 and older. In the 2023 Census Bureau estimates, we were already up to 416,000. And so part of that is, I'll get into this multiple times, but we have a generation that is a big one, generational group, and everyone's kind of aging up. And so the baby boomers, started really making their impact. They made their impact when they showed up, right? So if you go way back to the 1950 census that became public, all the records were public a couple years ago, there was a presentation, and the median age in the US had been increasing up to the 1950 census when it dipped way down because of the impact of the baby boom, and that's the first time that had happened. So y'all, any boomers in the room, you've been making a big impact since you entered the scene. We'll just start there. If we look at our age structure, so this is a population pyramid with the youngest population at the bottom, the oldest at the top, and then male, female on either side. We are still the youngest state in the nation, so we do have this robust base to build on, but you can see that base is narrowing. So as we think about aging, one, it's an opportunity because it's something we can see coming for a very long time, right? It's not a surprise. COVID, I think, threw a wrench in things and kind of changed the impacts of aging for a big chunk of the population. However, generally, if you're born, you do get to continue to age if you have a healthy life, and so you can see this coming, right? It's not it's not a sneak attack, so we can plan ahead for it. In 2023, in the Census Bureau estimates, over a third of Utahns over 65 live in Salt Lake County. So, 75% of us live along the Wasatch Front, just Utahns in general, but over a third of 65 and older Utahns are in Salt Lake County. So that's just something to consider. Different areas have different experiences. If we compare with Utah County, they have a lot more kids, a lot more babies, and so that experience is going to be a little different than how Salt Lake County, is experiencing that. And that's over 145,000 residents. So this is the one map I have of the county, but just again, kind of highlighting the data that Ella showed with the 1-year estimates rather than the 5-year. But the east side of Salt Lake County is older, has a larger share of older adults than the west side. So that's something to consider. And you kind of see some similar things if we zoom into Salt Lake City, for example. The east side of Salt Lake City has much larger shares of older residents than the west side. So as you keep zooming into your data, recognize that your community needs are going to vary wherever you are in your community. But we've got some very different things happening. And then as we get down to the southern part of the county, and kind of if we had Utah County in here, you'd see the much lighter shades in that Salt Lake and Utah County meeting point. In the 2020 decennial data, which I know we're now way out from that, but it was such a big deal to finally get it after it was delayed, we're still gonna highlight it. Half of the cities in Utah with high populations of over 65 residents were in Salt Lake County. Washington County is another big home and center to residents over 65, but I think it's interesting to see those same communities you saw pop on the map are holding strong in that position with high shares of 65 and older residents. And as mentioned, Washington County is different. There is a larger population, but I wanted to show the share of residents over 65 by county to just kind of give that broader lens and just the reminder that there are different experiences throughout the state. We've got some communities that have been much older for quite some time, a lot of our more rural areas with smaller populations. The young people have been moving out, and the older people have stayed and remained, and those populations are strong, but they're experiencing this in a very different way than kind of the Wasatch Front is, or if we even take apart the Wasatch Front, the different counties along the Wasatch Front. And here's another opportunity. Chatting with Alan last night made me want to kind of frame things as like, look at all these great options we have, instead of like, this thing is coming, it's scary. So one thing is, being the youngest state in the nation, we've got a lot of examples we can turn to look for other communities that have maybe done things well, or they haven't done them well, and improve on the methods and models that they've created. So this is just showing the US, and you can see, you know, us in Texas, two fast-growing states. We're experiencing a really different age structure and picture than the rest of the US. And we could look to the Northeast for some examples, because they've been going through this journey a little bit longer than we have. So I know this is kind of a jump around, but I just wanted to highlight the baby boomers. This is the births in the US, in Utah. So we're the red line here, and the US is the gray line. And I was kind of telling some folks about this last night, but you can see in kind of, we have time to think about this and plan for the future. In the US, after the baby boom, you did have a bit of a dip, and then it comes back up, right? In Utah, we just kept on trucking, we kept having loads of babies, and so the picture of the aging population in Utah is going to be a different experience, because yes, we're newer, I guess, to this aging process, but we're gonna have a continuing churn of people coming up into 65 plus in bigger and bigger elements of the population, whereas in the US, there might be a little bit of a like moment to catch breath and like reassess. Like, we need to keep using our entrepreneurial spirit, thinking about the aging population as we move out into the future. So this is just kind of another way to think about our 65 and older population now, but if we look at that birth chart, you know, the population, the births were much lower prior to the baby boom. And so you see our older populations are just smaller shares of the 65 and older, and we're nearing 2/3 of our 65 and older population in that younger group that is the baby boom. So now we're going to dive into some demographic characteristics, and Ella touched on a couple of these, but I'll throw in a couple different age dynamics to maybe mix it up a little bit from what Ella has shared. So if we look at our older population, and these are going to be at the state level, it's right now less racially and ethnically diverse than younger residents. But again, as we keep aging and moving forward, that is going to shift and change. Our young residents now are much more racially and ethnically diverse than our older residents. And so is that everyone, hopefully, let's cross our fingers, we don't have any more global pandemics or any other big health scary things. But this is going to be something that changes over time. So something to consider as you're thinking about providing services to this population. This one is probably not a surprise, but labor force participation goes down after you hit 65. But just something to think about. I know some of the economists in our office are trying to think of, well, what if we want to open this up and let people keep working until they're 75 or 80? I don't want to have to keep working until I'm 75 or 80. If I can figure out an earlier retirement strategy than 65, that would be super. But just know some economists in the room are thinking about things with a slightly different lens with labor force participation. But this is something to think about. Again, you've got different uses of time, you've got different mobility with finances, which I'll flip to in the next slide, but just some different things to think about. And obviously men and women are experiencing that a little differently as they age. So this is just median household income by age of householder. So this is a like, go read the footnotes. Like, but there could be a 30-year-old living with a 69-year-old, but and the 69-year-old owns the home. So that's whose information is going to kind of set the bar here. But you can see kind of tied in with that decreased labor force participation rate, incomes go down once you have an older householder. And so that changes, you're probably not buying quite as many like concert tickets, I don't know, like frivolous items, things change, your spending habits are gonna change as your income changes as well. And then again, looking at poverty levels, if we look at men and women or male and female, you see some differences. And I think this is one where it is interesting. that the women have higher poverty rates as they're older than the men. So another thing to consider when thinking about the population. As you know, you got to keep disaggregating the data, right? It's good to have one starting point, but don't stop at the median. Dig into the median a little bit to understand your community and who you're trying to serve. Another one that's probably not a surprise, but 65 and older has great health insurance coverage. In talking to my parents this morning, my mom was talking about AARP and some Medicare supplement or whatever she's getting through AARP, and I was like, okay, I'll bring that note to the meeting, thank you. You know, it's good that people are leaning into services. For me, I feel nervous for when I get to reach this age range. I don't know that that's going to be an option for me. Who knows? The sustainability and solvency of some of these programs might be tricky to navigate as we just have continuing groups getting older and older. And then this one I think is really interesting. So statewide, we've seen an increase in people living alone, single person households, and you definitely see that here in the 65 and older population. So that medium gray, we have a lot of grays on this chart, but the medium gray at the bottom is people living alone in that 65 and over age range. And I have a bunch of different numbers that I can spout off to you if you want specifics and different how it looks at the county or for numbers overall. But it's interesting that part of this big increase has been in that 65 or older population. It's not just, you know, young kids starting their lives out and getting an apartment alone. It's a difference there. This one's also interesting because if we again divide by male and female, women are far more likely, in part because women have longer life expectancies, so that could be part of why the over 65 population has a higher share of non-family living alone. But looking at Salt Lake County, it's over double. So the males living alone is like 11,000 and women is like 24,000. So, you know, speaking to social isolation, things like that, you might want to consider who those people are living alone and how you could serve them in different ways. I'm not going to touch on this too long because Dayon has some really cool maps coming up for you looking at different housing things, but just to remind you that in Utah at the state level, older Utahns are more likely to own homes, but the share of renters in the red is a significant group as well. We'll dive into over a quarter of Utah homeowners are over 65. And I don't know if there's one figure that we showed at a different event yesterday where it has mortgage rates and debt and everything. It's a really interesting one. I'll find it. It's beautiful, but also alarming because it's like, oh, well, why would you leave your home? You're locked in. You're set at a very affordable, reasonable price spot. Why would you leave? So one thing to consider with the renters is cost burden. So you can see this is one where it's a smaller population. So again, opportunity, it's a smaller population. So you could maybe target policies or programs to get this group that's a smaller population, you know, in a little bit easier way than if you're trying to target every 65 and over resident in the state. But the cost burden, renters over 65 is a pretty high share of renters. So something to consider. You know, even though we do have this large group of homeowners, those renters are experiencing things in a really difficult way. And I think probably some of the people Ella spoke to were experiencing this very acutely. So another thing that we do for the state at the Gardner Institute are population projections. And I'm actually going to show you our old projections. And we have a new batch of a 10-year look out into the future coming out next week. So sorry I couldn't share those with you today. But I just want to, again, we know this is coming, right? So the last group of baby boomers hits age 65 in 2029 using Pew's generational cohort definitions. There's my footnote. Gen X is going to start hitting 65 in 2030. Like, that's around the corner. So I think that's another thing to think of. And part of, like, speaking of older Utahns and things like that, I've been thinking of my parents. I can't say old people, like that's a way for me to get in trouble. So like trying to think of who these people are that are turning 65, like let's remind ourselves it's, you know, it's Ethan Hawke and Winona. And then, And then millennials are going to start hitting 65 in 2046. So we have a little minute for everything to get lined up and set up great before we start hitting 65. But just to keep that in mind, because as we look out in that 40-year span, it's an important thing to consider. So if we look back, this is just kind of the total population in red, and then the share is the line. And then as we look forward, turns out we don't think this is going to slow down or stop. We think Utah's population is going to continue to grow. We think a lot of it will actually be from migration because of changes in birth rates. And our large families aren't necessarily the norm anymore. People are having fewer kids, so we're going to have more older adults, and this is going to become the norm. But we've got that just kind of nonstop past era of births, right, that will hopefully be aging into the future. And so that plus new people moving in, if they stay, once they move in, as young adults and they call Utah home, they stay and age up, it's something that we need to think about in the planning process.
I had a hard time preparing to talk about housing and baby boomers. From an economic standpoint, it's the generation, if you've seen those memes of like, what is my biggest obstacle to affording housing is I was born at the wrong time. When housing was cheap, I was watching Nickelodeon. And this is something that baby boomers benefited, right? The post-World War II, booming economy, we're the only country in the world really that wasn't exponentially recovering from World War II. And so overall, the generation itself, is an affluent generation, but there is a segment of the population that is suffering. That's why we're here today. If we just zoom in on Salt Lake County a little bit, if we look at tenure by age cohorts, you look at the younger generation, so millennials with a little bit of Gen Z in there, 80% are renters. If we go over to the right and we look at baby boomers, we have about 90,000 households in Salt Lake County, and about 19% are renters. Majority are homeowners, as Mallory stated. Where do these people live? Okay, if we look at this gray line or gray bars, those are owners. About 35% have been in their house, 1990 or before. So you think about the appreciation, the equity, right? These homeowners have benefited from the run-up of two real estate cycles, and if we go down the years more and more, right? But all that's to say is baby boomers overall have a lot of equity for those that are homeowners. But if we look at renters, okay, so if we think about the 17,000 renters that are 65 plus in Salt Lake County, go all the way down to the bottom. 40% are recent renters. They became renters within the last couple of years. Okay, so this is really interesting. And when we're talking about housing needs, cost burdens, it's really this segment of the population that we're talking about. And where do they live? Well, the owners, 90%, a little over 90% are in single-family detached homes. Probably concentrated from the two maps we've seen from Ella and Mallory on the East Bench. When we're thinking about long-term, if I had a business idea, it would be a East Bench home flipper come mid-2030s, right? There's going to be a lot of housing stock that's dated, that needs to be updated. That in itself presents an opportunity. So, if we're looking at housing starts, we have a housing shortage right now, but going forward, into the late 2030s, I think just on its own, if we just keep up construction, housing shortage disappears because we're going to have a release of single-family homes in more affluent areas, and that'll be important later. The challenge is if we're looking at how net worth of households. Okay, in the U.S., an average homeowner has the average homeowner net wealth is about $400,000. Okay, a renter is just under $11,000. Okay, and it's concentrated with young people. So if we're thinking about an aging population, insolvency with Social Security, we start getting disparities. We have a portion of population now that's retired that needs to be taken care of, but then there is this segment of the population that's not creating wealth. This chart is a U.S. chart, and it shows at about 35 years of age, by generation, millennials in red, Gen X in black, and gray, the baby boomers. Okay, in about mid-30s, baby boomers had about 32% of the real estate wealth in the country. Okay, they had as much wealth as the two generations after them have combined. So this presents a policy challenge, later in the 2030s, and the trend's not going to change, at least on this part, I think. So we're going to have generations that, the millennial generation is the first generation that's projected to not have more wealth than their parents, right? So this will present interesting challenges in the later decades of how do we keep the economy going, keep the social services funded, basically, if there's a whole generation that's not catching up on wealth. So we bring that all back to housing, whether you disagree or agree that household wealth creation is the best option to create wealth, it's all we got at the moment. So this is showing Utah in general, in the red line, what's our median sales price. We're the 8th most expensive state in the country. And so the opportunities to enter the housing market, to build that wealth currently, it's been the topic for the last couple of years, is very challenging. If we look at just a little bit more nuanced data, this red line shows our median sales price over the last several years, and that blue line represents the median monthly payment based on the interest rate and sales price. So you can see, basically mid-2018 to beginning of 2021, as housing prices increased because interest rates were falling, our entry to the housing market pretty much stayed flat. The monthly payment minus taxes and insurance was about $1,500, and all hell breaks loose as the Fed starts raising interest rates. So that monthly payment goes from $1,500 to about $3,200, right? Right now the market's just priced out. If we just look at our state, how have the housing prices changed? So, this year, overall through the first 6 months, in Salt Lake County, our median sales price was about $530,000. Relatively expensive to get in. You need an income of about $153,000 to afford that with a 10% down payment, right? And so it's shifting our housing stock in terms of tenure, what we're seeing, because if we look at what is the cost difference between renting a single-family home across the Wasatch Front and buying a single-family home that's there in red, you're paying about a $1,300 premium to get a house versus renting it. And so as a result, majority of our renters are priced out. So this is just a chart for the whole state. 92%, basically 9 out of 10 renters cannot afford the median priced home right now. So when we look at cost burden for seniors, so this is all across the U.S. from the Harbor Joint Center. You look at Utah there, roughly, 38% in the Salt Lake metro area of seniors are cost burdened. So if we look at, a good chunk of seniors have their house owned outright, so their cost burdens are relatively low. Their mortgage is paid off. All they have to look at really is their property tax. So, pretty much the whole state, our cost burden for those who own their house outright is, between 10 to 19%. Okay, if we look at those with the mortgage, it jumps up to about 45%. Okay, then if we look at renters, and remember from earlier there was that chart of new renters. So renters, senior renters, they have a higher share of cost burden. So in Salt Lake metro area, it's about 55% of renters are cost burden, where just overall renters is about 45%. So we are seeing this cost burden affects seniors more than the rest of the population in general. Now, how many of you have heard the phrase a silver tsunami? Okay. What it means, we have an aging population, majority homeowners. Eventually, they're going to be out of their house in one way or another. I think what we're going to see too is, I call it silver squatting. So people aren't able to get out of their house because they have this house that's a great asset, but how do they transfer that wealth now? Because the market's locked in. Buying a house is extremely challenging right now, and they're forced to age in place, right? And so that's going to create an interesting dynamic as well. Now, if we look at just new household formations over the next 20 years, this is from the Urban Institute, where are we going to gain new households? Okay, it's pretty much 65 plus, right? That's, as a nation, that's where most of our housing demand is going to be the next 2 decades, right? We're focusing on starter homes, which is desperately needed, but the majority of the problem that we're going to have to face is serving the 65 plus crowd. So, you know, Zillow did this great analysis a couple of years ago where they've looked at, based on the 65 plus crowd, what is the cumulative share of owner-occupied homes estimated to be released into the market by seniors by 2037? Okay, and this is for the broader, bigger metro areas, but look all the way to the right. Okay, we have the lowest share of homes that will be released, but it's still roughly 20%. Okay, today it's just under 10%. So there is this dynamic happening, right? The older population wants to downsize. They want to have more housing options, single floor living. We see a lot of, you know, contracting updates happening right now to those individuals that have the affluence to be able to turn their house into single living. But if we, as Ella pointed out, if we look at our zoning, how can we build single floor living effectively that's affordable without major zoning components changed to be able to provide that housing option, right? So that gets over into transit and all the public services needed to sustain this population. So I'll leave you with this too. You know, I shared this map, many of you have seen it. What's our housing demand? Just in the near term, we need roughly 150,000 new housing units based on household projections that are coming by the end of the decade. So we still have a lot of work to do because our housing system is broken, it's locked. There's every single aspect of obtaining housing, whether you're renting or buying, is facing a bottleneck, whether it's interest rates, whether it's policy, whether it's finance, right? So to really serve this population, there's no silver bullet. There's like 100 different things we could do to make it happen. So, you know, just alone in the county, we still need roughly over 42,000 new homes built in the next 6 years. And so, you know, with that, I always say I have the easiest job in real estate and policy because I just get to talk about it. You guys all have to solve it. So I'll tee it up with that, and I'm excited to hear about the solutions forthcoming. Thank you.